Words about Ray. Ray has another book coming out from Wesleyan, Conjure. Her previous book was Wobble. She is a Professor Emerita from University of California, San Diego. So Ray, take it away.
Okay. Fanny Howe is the author of, as far as I could ascertain by counting, 16 books of poetry, as well as 16 novels, and several collections of essays. Two of her most recent books are The Needle's Eye, which doesn't fall quite into any of those categories. It's a hybrid fiction, poem, essay, weaving together elements from the lives of St. Francis of Assisi, Simone Weil, and the Boston Bombers. And Love and I, a poetry collection about which I will say more in a while. Her work has been awarded, well, lots of awards, including the Ruth Lilly Award from the Poetry Foundation, the Lenore Marshall Award from the Academy of American Poets. She was a finalist for the Man Booker Prize and for the National Book Award. And she is, I believe, the recipient of a Guggenheim. She's from and currently is living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I got to know her in San Diego, where she taught at UC San Diego for 12 years, and we became friends. I had never met anyone remotely like her, still haven't. Fanny is the former, this is scare quote, slum goddess of the Lower East Side, a title from back in the day, clearly. And she is also someone who spends her summers at a monastery in Ireland. I knew her poems long before we met. I was drawn to their musicality. It seems to me she has just about the best ear of any poet writing. Her poems are meditative, but they aren't quiet. They snap and crackle with provocative insight. They come from radical politics and from a mysticism that isn't at all misty or sentimental. I want to quote a short section from her sequence, The Quietist, to illustrate this. Zero built a nest in my navel, incurable, longing, blood too, from violent actions. It's a nest belonging to one, but zero uses it, and its pleasure is its own. There's so much to unpack here. I could start with the way zero and navel and incurable chime together sonically, or I could say this is a meditation on the most charged of relationships, that between one and zero, or someone and no one. I could talk about how surprising the poem is. Zero built a nest in your navel? Well, yes. Nests are round, zeros are round, and so is that letter O sitting conspicuously at the end of the word zero. To me, the conjunction of nest with zero suggests emptiness, the loneliness of the one single person. But the poem doesn't dwell on that, doesn't take that perspective. After all, zero is the protagonist, and it is not experiencing pain, but some unknowable pleasure. Fanny may be a mystic, but she also keeps it real. In her poem, The Descent, she writes, "You really ought to tender how you sail by eye. Your soul is just a length of baby." I love that so much. This is a startling way to say, don't get ahead of yourself. The word baby is that me?
Yeah.
Turn that off, please, Chuck, sorry.
Yeah.
Where was I? Oh yeah, the word baby is often used as a put down in our country, like don't be such a baby, such a big baby. Fanny dares to say she is one, that we're all babies. We have grown the outer shell of ego, but still. She doesn't shy away from infancy, and neither does she avoid old age. In O'Clock, she writes, "I am as old as the young will ever be. No, I mean wild." I think all her books may be adventure stories in that she invites us to see life as a leap of faith. Her most recent poetry collection, Love and I, has a cover with a drawing of a small biplane flying in stormy weather. Her work always shows a strong identification with the weak and with those we now call marginalized, though I imagine she would hate that term. Jargon is distancing. In Love and I, on the other hand, there is a poem sequence in which she joins a group of homeless teenagers sleeping in a park. And then there's one girl who, quote, covers her head with a crown and hoodie. You never know is her mantra. I think of that girl as Fanny's doppelganger. The last sequence in that book is about lambs led to slaughter and factory farming, and I'll read a section of that. At first there were folds, now there are millions of mass-produced bundles of wool. And then skipping down a bit, the sheep, little siblings of no harm done, bridal curls, cotton in the clover. Who else would think to call wool bridal curls, to call sheep cotton in the clover? It sounds lovely, but is a way of identifying with the lost. So now, here is one of my favorite poets and people, Fanny Howe.
Thank you, Ray.
You are so welcome.
I'm sorry I shouted that awful invective at the beginning.
Well, I'll have to try to prevent that from happening anymore.
Yes, please block that one out. This is so amazing to do, and then I'm sitting here alone talking to myself, basically. And then the whole thing of you having mastered all these incredible devices, as they call them. It's insane. What we wouldn't have known 10 years ago, we wouldn't have even thought of it. So here we are, cross-continental. I'm going to read a bit of The Needle's Eye, which Ray mentioned, and then read some poems from a brand new anthology that just came out. Embryonic. Once upon a time in Uzbekistan, there was a boy named Farouk who had the soul of a poet. His mother had died giving birth to him. His father, inconsolable, drank until he too died. Soon after, the boy Farouk awoke to the hypocrisy and meanness of his neighbors and set off into the wilderness. Before he left, a beautiful girl he knew begged him to marry her and take her with him. But he turned her down and left with his best friend Khalid to strike out into the vast mountains of the Caucasus. He wanted to be free. They carried a bag, a Quran, and a comb. Farouk looked like a 12-year-old boy, Khalid 15. It was the time of St. Francis, when people tramped the Silk Road back and forth, carrying merchandise for sale. The boys were good boys. They wanted to be happy and to do no violence to humans or nature. They didn't want to meet danger or experience it. They were idealistic adolescents, like medieval beatniks. Farouk read the Quran aloud to his sleeping friend by the fireside at night. The book was his map. So this classic folktale, it could be told in any culture and has been, sets out to show whether self-realization is possible for two teenage boys who have nothing and seek nothing. In so many folktales, it's like this, a struggle on the part of a youth to transcend and escape the ugly fate of adults, a belief in heavenly rewards, even an earthly utopia where justice reigns, so the child can safely remain a child. This utopia cannot include parents. An acceptable grown-up must be a failure, wanderer, street person, or artist. This vision is an open field with its horizons blurring into great shining cities and parapets that are not silver, not gold. Justice, fidelity, irony, and sincerity are the prevailing moods of this paradise that the kids can sometimes glimpse in nature, movies, poems, drugs, songs, and games. An adolescent believes in great wonders and despises adult bitterness. and is capable of heroic delinquency. The news from around the world only fuels his rage for justice. An adolescent needs one selfless teacher or belief system to turn his disillusionment into art, as the Uzbek movie, The Man Who Loved the Birds, shows. This is the movie I'm describing now. The Uzbek filmmaker Ali Kamraev made it. His films are poems with dark pauses between scenes, operating like blinks of the eye of God, like seconds of mercy given and withdrawn. In the middle of his film, we see the joy of first love under the almond trees, where birds the children call the angels of life hover. Birds in almost all religions are the angels of angels. They're divine messengers, and in Islamic literature, they come as direct messages from Allah. This scene in the movie is part of a tradition dating way back even to Noah's Ark. The birds in this film are harbingers with long, heavy tail wings, unlike the little flocks that spin across horizons. These birds are a warning of children molested and slaughtered. Only one of them survives through the intervention of a martial artist and poet who turns the boy's fury into a dance. Farouk's story takes place in the 14th century, when the historical Tamerlan was a Mongol sheep rustler and bandit in Uzbekistan. His wife was descended from Genghis Khan, and Tamerlan mobilized a huge army and slammed his way through Damascus, Persia, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Turkey into Baghdad, where he had 90,000 citizens beheaded, thousands more buried alive, women raped and children kidnapped. At the same time, he was a great patron of the arts and architecture. Likewise, the British colonial army invaded and occupied India and Africa, killing along the way, while British citizens built monuments, wrote poetry, cultivated gardens, and composed drama. What is dragged along and dropped after the brutish footsteps recede is a dream, a word, and the deja vu of a child with a wooden sword in its hand. A few days before bombs went off at the Boston Marathon, the newspapers and screens showed 5 Afghan babies looking as if they'd split open their colorful cocoons, ready to fly. They had been struck down by NATO planes. The picture came and went until a few days later, when a little boy, Martin Richard, was blown up at the marathon. Then the pileup of babies seemed to span the earth, and there was no border that could not be measured by the bodies of children with round, closed faces. The 2 brothers who lived a few blocks from Harvard and who seemed typical of the kids we all knew pretty well for half a century were poor but educated, bilingual, politically conscious, some of the time stoned, sometimes disciplined and athletic, first-generation American kids whose parents were still inflamed and tormented by the recent past that drove them to America. You'd see these kids skateboarding away from crowded households with sisters they cared for and parents with broken hopes and talents, single mothers, angry men, and tenement living, political ideas switching into religious ideology, divorce into abandonment, chicken on the stove, greens in the pan. The children assembled their own tribes where they knocked around basketballs and stole candy and smoked weed, crawled over pot black snow and got help in community health centers. They tagged at night and stole chips and Twix by day. They dealt drugs, purchased guns for quick robberies, did their homework, laughed inside the Broadway supermarket after school, and planned to return to their homelands. Hatred of capitalism was a common theme. Once, back in the 80s in the Caucasus, a boy was born to be adored and pampered by both of his parents. He was dressed in fine clothes, his hair smoothed out, and was sent to music school to learn the piano. He was the firstborn. 2 girls followed and then a 4th, a boy who arrived too late to be pampered or noticed much at all, except to be adored, kissed, stroked, and forgiven for being in the room. He was the youngest and so pretty. This boy, Jahar, was named after a Chechen leader and hero, Jahar Dudayev, blown up by the Russians through a telephone. Jahar and his brother, Tamerlan, who heard voices, assembled a pressure cooker bomb, 7 IEDs, an M4 carbine, 2 handguns, and a BB gun. At least that much, according to the FBI. A bomb was hauled from the Charles River a few days after the marathon. Nails, nails, nails. Almost as much as the detonation itself. The following days of sirens and helicopters shut in lights, the full force of American surveillance produced a collective trauma, culminating with a thermal image of a boat in dry dock. All day evening was descending over the city. In those hours, we learned that thermal imaging supplies night vision. Warm bodies stand out against cooler ones and are made visible in the dark. It's very useful in military situations and in domestic surveillance. It's infrared and spreads abnormal colors. So we were treated to a spectral image of an ordinary teen sprawled inside the pale outline of a boat in dry dock, with its white cover ripped aside like a collapsed sail. It was an image that put the final touch on the explosive 4 days. No one could have thought up such a stunning and ethereal conclusion to the massive show of police and military force we saw on television and outside the window. That brief flash of film captured something reminiscent of a myth, a boy in a boat, his naked belly and ribs exposed to the night sky and its satellites. Jahar was strangely, throughout all the ordeals, like a person from another, as yet unexplored nation, like one set to translate his own words. He hovered back and over. He was formal and restrained. Now a beautiful boy, now a zombie, a doper, a sweetheart, now a migrant washed up on the banks of the Charles River in Watertown. Then a child who cried for 3 days in the hospital. It's strange how postures at rest assume an archetypal, even religious glaze. It's as if, despite all history to the contrary, the stranger or the child wins the afterlife. And now I received, out of the blue, because I'd totally forgotten about this anthology called North American Women Poets. It's just been completed. It's the 3rd of I think a 3-set collection of anthologies. The first one, Ray, you were in the first one, right? Anyway, here I am, and I discovered they had chosen poems of mine that I don't see often, and so I thought I'd read some of these to end up. This one is from my book, The Lyrics, and it's called 40 Days. When donkeys traveled without glancing to the side, long lashed and buckled inside their own hide, when they brayed for joy into the gray industrial clouds, and the cows replied like balloons deflating into moos, the strain on the immaculate heart was as grave as it could get. Awful pity to be so blessed as to pound for happiness. Give me my shawl, my corkscrew, and my cloth bag. Give me my hot water bottle and my book. Give me my stick and my water, one shoe for walking and one to dance. No stability, thirst, the will to keep moving, an instrument's heat, bald mountains and a spider that was a leaf. The scheme is organic. It knows itself. See that light across the enslaved sea. Redemption time knows when. If I were Jesus, would you slap both sides of my face? If I were Jesus, would you stamp on my hands? If I was Jesus, would you lock me up? Would you make me crawl down the prison hall? Would you cover my head, stick my face in the pot? Would you rape me? If I were Jesus, would you break down the door? Would you wreck the house and terrify my family? If I was Jesus, would you bomb my trees, my place of parables, the fig trees and the rivers of wheat? If I were Jesus, well, I'm not. So please go right ahead. These are very grim poems coming out of the last decade or longer. We've been witnesses to, really, Americans are colonialists and witnesses. This is from a little book also published by Graywolf Press called Second Childhood. And this one is for the book. Yellow goblins and a god I can swallow. Eyes in the evergreens under ice. Interior monologue and some voice. Weary fears, the usual trials, and a place to surmise blessedness. The garden. Black winter gardens engraved at night keep soft frost on them to read the veins of our inner illustrator's hand, internally light with infant etching. Children booked on blizzard winds, and then the picture is blown to yonder and out of ink. The black winter verses are buds and sticks. Parkside. Stone walls and chalk scratches for different ages. None of us could be sure now how many we were or where. There were hurtful pebbles, cracked windows, and bikes. We cut the butter and the day's bread evenly. We were children and a metal bed. 12 loaves and 5,000 baskets. 5 baskets, 12 pieces of dough. 12 times 5 and butter for a multitude. Bread made, that is, with 12,000 inhalations of leaven. And then I'll end up with this poem called The Ninth Hour. At the ninth hour, you want to be clear. If you're sleeping, don't wake up. At the ninth hour, it's always night, a few hours after 4. Why did the names of seasons depress you that year? It was near the end, but not quite there. You had an hour to be happier on either side of Massachusetts Bay. But you were stricken at the word summer. I told you I couldn't turn around because I was going to Quincy, a place, not a season. The seasons are over. You have no land to leave to your children, not even a square the size of paper. That's why place names are saddening. Put them back in the drawer and return to Back Bay Station, to the hour of your humiliation. Only when it's over can you give the blessing. And I just wanted to say that the repetition of blessing is because I began to sort of understand what that gesture in a secular sense means, and why people do it at all, because of it sort of puts the finishing touch on what's finished and will never come back. That's what a blessing is. And it, of course, it's associated with the French word blesser, to wound